introduce today's speakers who are remote. They are in Southern California. They are part of an organization called CURB, C-U-R-B, Californians United for a Responsible Budget. And their goal, broadly speaking, is to eliminate prisons and keep people out of the carceral system. And they're going to tell you why that's important in just a moment. As I mentioned, they're on Zoom, so we'll just be viewing them on the screen up here, and I'll be, getting any comments entered by other participants on Zoom while they're speaking, and we'll do our Q&A in the normal way towards the end. So now I'd like to turn it over to Olivia and Tannah. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. It's so good to be with you. Please, at any time, if there are any audio issues, please interrupt us. Let us know if there's anything we can change on our end. But it's great to be with you. My name is Tannah Oppliger. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm a policy assistant at CURB. And I'll pass it over to Olivia to introduce.
Thank you, Tannah. Great to be here with y'all. And thank you, Jeff, and for that great introduction and for hosting us today. I'm Olivia Gleason, she, they pronouns, and I'm a communications assistant with CURB, mainly working on our external communications and some inside organizing too with incarcerated organizers. So great to be with y'all today.
Thanks, Olivia. And again, we just want to thank you so much. My church never prioritized these socially conscious conversations when I was growing up in Texas. And we know that faith groups and faith movements have actually been at the forefront of so many social movements. So, the world is a better place because of congregations like yours, and you're growing that legacy. So thank you so much for making space for this conversation today. So I think quickly we'll go over the agenda for today, just so you know what you're all getting into. If we can, perfect. Great. So we'll just talk a little bit about CURB, who we are, the history of prisons in California and prison expansion. We'll look at abolition, what it means in theory, what it means in practice, and CURB's practice. We'll dive a little bit more deeply into that by talking about CURB's Close California Prisons campaign, what the demands are of the campaign, what current advocacy looks like. And then we will take action together, and we'll make some time at the end for question and answer. Okay, great. So starting with who we are. So again, CURB stands for Californians United for a Responsible Budget. And it is a statewide coalition of more than 80 organizations. And many of those organizations are led by Black and currently and formerly incarcerated people and their loved ones. And when we talk about social organizing, social movement organizing, that's really, really critical because it's vital that these movements are led by folks who are most directly impacted by the system that you're trying to change or reform or eliminate in this case. And to break down CURB's 3-point mission, what we want to do, right? The first point is shifting wasteful spending away from incarceration toward communities. So this is the budget piece of CURB, right? We want to see money going away from cages, which we know don't actually keep communities safe and actually perpetuate harm. And we want to see that money going toward things in our community that we do know make us safe, like substance use treatment, like education, like job training, like alternatives to incarceration. And we'll talk more about that. The second point of our mission is to reduce the number of incarcerated people in California. So we have about 90,000 people in prison in California. A couple decades ago, it was like twice that. So we've made a lot of progress here, but 90,000 is 90,000 too many. The third point of our mission is to reduce the number of prisons and jails in our state. So as was mentioned earlier, we actually want to close prisons and jails. And the first bullet point and the third bullet point here are very closely connected, right? When we close prisons and jails, we're freeing up billions of dollars of taxpayer dollars that can then go into our communities, into things that we know actually make us safe. So before we explain exactly what that looks like in CURB's organizing, it's really important to understand why we do what we do. So we want to just take a few minutes to walk through a brief history of prison expansion in California and how and why it has been so harmful to so many of our communities and our neighbors. So what are the harms of prisons? This is probably going to be a lot of information you've heard before. But four major themes that are consistently demonstrated and proven in all of the data, and more importantly, in the experiences of folks who have been impacted by the justice system. The first is that prisons are really a public health crisis. We know that people in prisons die relative to the general population, die very early. They're a lot more likely to die from chronic conditions like cancer and heart disease. We also know that they are a lot more likely to die by suicide because of the trauma and the isolation that folks experience while incarcerated. And a big part of this is that prisons don't offer adequate care for mental or physical health concerns. So California has been sued and fined time and time and time again because they have failed to provide adequate health care for folks inside. The second major theme that we see is that prisons really destroy our environment. We see that the land surrounding prisons has really horrendous land, water, and air quality. And so we see a deep intersection between prison abolition and the environmental movement, because we know that when these prisons are no longer used this infrastructure is no longer used to warehouse people, our land and the surrounding community will also be better off. Third is all of the data shows that prisons target our communities. So we know that California prisons and all prisons across the United States intentionally and persistently target poor and marginalized people. And this particularly impacts Black and Brown people. Black people are the most disproportionately incarcerated in the United States, and this is by design. We know that racism comes into the carceral system at the very beginning with interaction with law enforcement, all the way through sentencing, all the way through whether they're found eligible for parole or not. So from the very beginning to the very end of like the path through the carceral system, Black people, people of color, people with disabilities are disproportionately impacted. And lastly, again, coming back to this budget piece in CURB's name, prisons have a huge grip on our resources. California prisons are extremely costly. Again, they pull money away from resources that could be benefiting our communities and keeping people safe toward caging people. And just to put a number to that idea, the corrections budget is about $19 billion per year. 19 billion, that is with a B, and that's a lot of money, a lot of money. Imagine what we could do with that money actually being in our communities. Okay, so we won't put too many numbers in front of you, but I think you don't have to pay too much attention to the exact numbers, but just look at the shape of this graph for a moment. And this graph is showing us the California prison population over time. So when you see here that through the beginning of California's, founding, at least by the settlers, the prison population was very, relatively low, about 20,000 people by 1980. And then between 1980 and 2010, so that's just a matter of 30 years, right? The prison population multiplied by about 8 times. And now it's fallen off. We'll get back to that. But that steep increase is what we want to pay attention to for these next couple minutes. So as the prison population goes up, what else are we seeing happen? We can go to the next slide. So as the prison population is filling up, prisons are being built to warehouse that incarcerated population. So in that same period, in that middle, when the prison population multiplied by 8 times, the number of prisons constructed in California multiplied by 3 times. So what's important to take away from these graphs and these numbers is that our reliance on incarceration was not always so enormous, right? It was a policy decision, and it is a policy decision, a choice to rely on incarceration in this way. And this policy choice is not the result of actual increases in crime or harm, right? It's not like crime just suddenly increased by 8 times. It is a policy choice that's based in profit and in power, and it's wrapped up in this ginormous system of incarceration that really exploded between 1980 and 2010. So we can understand this idea of profit and power a little bit more clearly when we look at the root causes of that prison boom between the 80s and the 10s. So we know that the building of prisons was largely a control response to greater unemployment. After the loss of manufacturing military jobs, especially in like rural and inland economies, prisons were built to employ people essentially. And I think a lot of people don't know that about the prison boom, that prisons were seen as an economic solution to addressing unemployment. And they're still seen this way, and it's really important to understand this because one of our greatest opposing forces to prison closure are labor unions and the towns with prisons that are in them because of the jobs that these prisons provide. And then, of course, the other pieces that led to the prison boom was not just the building of those prisons, but the filling of them, right? So the prisons must be filled to produce that profit and power. And so during this time, we also saw greater policing in cities. We saw the state respond very strongly to social and political unrest, especially Black liberation movements. And we saw things like the war on drugs, right? Very long sentences for certain charges, especially drug possession, even very low level drug possession offenses. Okay, and then if you remember on that graph a few slides ago, we also saw this downtick in the prison population, right? So what led to that prison population reduction between 2010 and now? A few things. There's been really strong movement-driven prison reforms and decarceration policies. We can talk more about that, but our movement has really focused on policy as a way to get people out of prison. There were also COVID releases when the pandemic hit. There was so much overcrowding inside of California prisons that many folks were released, and we've seen that that can be done safely. And third, there have been shifts in populations to county jails because, again, there has been so much overcrowding in prisons. The Supreme Court basically told California, like, y'all have to address this. You need to move some of your folks out. So California moved people from prisons into a lot of jails around the state. And obviously, we would just like to see them released, but this is one of the reasons that the prison population has shrunk. Lastly, why does this matter? Why does it matter? Why does the prison population matter? Of course, it matters because we don't want to see people in cages, and it's inhumane to keep them there. And it also matters because a reduced prison population means that prisons can close. Prisons can close. So we want to really stress that prison closure is possible. Like, it is already happening. You might already know this, but there have been 3 California prisons that have been announced for closure in the last few years. And there was a private prison that California had a contract with that they've now terminated. So essentially 4 prison closures and some yard closures across the state. So while this is radical and based in, radical, like, beautiful Black liberation work, it is also like happening and very realistic. It's also possible because, you know, we're in this time where California is facing a really huge budget deficit, and CDCR is a money pit. As we already talked about, prisons are really draining our resources. And California is estimated to save $1 billion from closing just 5 prisons. So we are constantly making the point in our advocacy that if we close even 5 prisons, we could save $1 billion, and that's a huge budget solution in this deficit environment that we're facing right now. And lastly, sort of along the lines of, you know, prison closure is already happening. The demands for prison closure are not just being, you know, spouted by us. They're actually being backed by the legislature itself and the governor's legislative analyst office, which is basically like their budget consultants. The LAO has called for 5 prisons to be closed because they're emptying. Spending so much money on them is wasteful when there's so many empty beds. They're dilapidated, and they are just a drain on California's resources.
Thanks so much for all of that really, really helpful background, Tannah, and what has led us to the point we're in now, where prisons really are closing and can keep closing. We'll just go a little bit before getting more into curb specific work with our Closed California Prisons campaign, some of the theory and practice kind of that guides our work, and this is really abolition. The working definition we use of abolition, prison industrial complex abolition is a political vision with the goal of eliminating imprisonment, policing, and surveillance, and creating lasting alternatives to punishment and imprisonment. So it really takes into account all these like intersecting aspects of the prison industrial complex. It's not just prisons, it's not just policing, it's not just surveillance, but how all of these kind of like carceral apparatuses and legs of the PIC work and function together. And abolition seeks to not only dismantle them, but also build up lasting alternatives. I feel like that second part can be lost sometimes when we're talking about dismantling it. It's also building up, like Tannah was saying, shifting all those resources to the areas we know are proven to keep people safe and healthy. And just a quick, and this might be a definition you already know, but a quick recap: prison industrial complex is a term we use to describe the overlapping interests of government and industry that use surveillance, policing, and imprisonment as solutions to economic, social, and political problems. So really all those factors that Tannah talked about that led to that incarceration boom of the 80s, 90s, early 10s, kind of were all functions of the prison industrial complex, and abolition seeks to tear those down. In abolition, this is kind of a helpful way to think about abolition: abolitionist reforms versus reformist reforms. Abolitionist reforms do not increase the scope, scale, or life of the prison industrial complex in any way. They do take power away from these systems through control measures or defunding, and they do grow community-based alternatives that are needed in order to ensure the dismantling of the PIC. So this is really key. I'm an example you might see of a reformist reform. Something that does not take the power and scope away from the prison industrial complex might be like body cameras for police. These add to police budgets. They don't counteract the like narrative we have that police keep us safe. They're kind of fueling the system or acting as though we can reform policing to be better when we know it's inherently flawed and our resources could be better spent on other areas. And yeah, so that's some background on abolition and kind of the lens we use to guide our campaign. The Closed California Prisons campaign, I'll just go into demands, and then Tannah will talk more about kind of our current focus areas. Like Tannah said, 3 prisons have been slated for closure already. 2 are already in warm shutdown, which is a term we use when prisons are closed, they're emptied. But unfortunately, the state does keep them at a kind of like minimally operational state. So if they were needed again, they can be reopened. So warm shutdowns, even when a prison closes, it's a success for us. But it's kind of a note that there's still more we need to do, and we need to kind of keep following these warm shutdowns to ensure closures actually mean real closures permanently and that resources are shifted. So 2 are already in warm shutdown. 1 more is on its way in November, and 1 private lease that CDCR, the department that runs the correction system in California, has ended. And our current demands for the campaign are to close or to get 10 more state prisons committed for closure, or a total of 10 more 10 prisons, 7 more by 2025 slated for closure, starting with the urgent closure of CRC Norco. And Tannah will go into more of the specific reasons why we're focusing on CRC. A detailed state prison closure plan that prioritizes the needs of incarcerated people. We see oftentimes the state never has had a plan for prison closure, and when they do close prisons, it's kind of done in a ad hoc one-off way that creates a lot of chaos for people inside surrounding communities. So we're trying to advocate for like a plan really to ensure that prison closures are done in a more formalized way that really takes into account the voices of people that will be impacted by the closures. The demolition or repurposing of closed prisons for non-carceral use. And this is exactly why we fight against warm shutdowns. We want prisons to be closed so they can never be reopened again. And so communities can really see the real opportunity prison closures present. The reinvestment of savings in community-based care for marginalized communities, as well as labor and economic solutions in towns where prisons close. So yeah, prison closure really doesn't leave anyone behind. It's really an opportunity, and it can lead to, I think, fear and uncertainty because California is so heavily reliant on prisons. But really, the goal of prison closure is to create healthier communities that are better funded, better invested in for everyone. So no community is reliant on some extractive form of caging people that is first of all harmful for all the reasons Tannah described earlier and is not sustainable. So really, prison closure is a pathway to better economic solutions for everyone. And the reduction of the prison population through releases is always, like Tannah said, prisons won't close if the population isn't reducing. So that's always a kind of like formative pillar of our work. I'll pass it to you, Tannah.
Okay. Thanks so much, Olivia. Yeah, so those were obviously the demands of our campaign, and now we want to kind of talk to you all about how we realize those demands. So what are our current focus areas right now? How are we sort of seeing that out? So let's start with prison closure. What does it actually look like to close state prisons? This is a constant focus for us. As we've talked about, it's a part of our mission statement is prison closure and the closure of carceral facilities broadly. And as Olivia just mentioned, the state has never had a plan for prison closure and how to do it responsibly and how to do it in a timely manner, how to do it in a way that protects folks who are incarcerated. So this slide shows an outline of a major report that CURB published last year called the Roadmap for Prison Closure. And it lays out what we think is the first concrete plan for prison closure in California. And we'll just kind of walk through these steps. So the first phase of prison closure is selecting prisons for closure. CURB did a survey of over 2,000 incarcerated individuals a few years ago and asked them what criteria should be taken into account when prisons are selected for closure. And they chose things like the number of people who are dying by suicide or homicide inside, the distance from loved ones in major metropolitan areas, health hazards that folks are facing inside, the cost of incarceration, things like this. So in our report, we actually list out 10 prisons that we would prioritize for closure based on those criteria of incarcerated individuals. After selecting prisons for closure, the second phase is prison population reduction. So again, we don't only want to see prisons closed, we also need to see people released from cages. And this is the way that we do this is a mixture of implementing past legislation that's already been ongoing and passing new legislation. So when we talk about past legislation, I think this is one of the things that I've learned the most since like starting abolition work, is that there are thousands of people who are incarcerated in California prisons that are eligible to be released based on previously passed policies. But because, public defenders' offices are lacking money because there's so many cases to get through to resentence folks, a lot of those thousands of people are just sitting in cages, even though they're eligible to be released. So when we talk about prison population reduction, it's a matter of making sure those policies are implemented so folks are actually released who are eligible to be, and passing new legislation that takes a look at like really how to let more people out. The third phase is we call a decarceral just transition, but this is basically the idea that we want to see better, more healthy, thriving, constructive economies take the place of prison economies. So when a prison does close, we want to see that communities impacted by that prison are taken care of. That not only means the people who were incarcerated there, but also the people in the town where prisons closed, the people who were employed by the prison. Like, how are we really making sure that we can sustainably move away from a prison economy? And the fourth phase is prison repurposing. So as Olivia mentioned a couple slides ago, we always want to make sure that when prisons close, they're not just going to be like reused as, for instance, a immigration detention center, which is done a lot. There have been many instances where prisons close in California and then ICE scoops them up and uses them for immigrant detention. We want to see that never happen. So we want to see closed prisons repurposed into something that's totally different, that's an asset to a community, that doesn't cage or warehouse people, and that can, produce income and capital for a community. So that is sort of our constant focus, and the first one to tell y'all about. The second is a site focus, and this is sort of newer. We've really closed in on this specific prison in the last 1 to 2 years. As Olivia mentioned earlier, we're really focusing in on the closure of California Rehabilitation Center in Norco, otherwise known as CRC. And the Closed California Prisons campaign has really focused in on Norco CRC for several reasons. I mentioned a couple slides ago that we took a survey of over 2,000 incarcerated individuals and asked them what should be taken into account when we select prisons for closure. Based on all of the criteria that they gave us, Norco CRC came out as #1. It is our top priority for closure. And a lot of the reasons for that are things like climate disasters. It's very vulnerable it's in a wildfire zone. We know that folks who are incarcerated, there's not like a good evacuation plan in the case of climate disasters. There's extreme overheating. It reaches triple digits in the IE, and especially inside these cramped cages. We've heard stories about unsafe drinking water coming out of the faucets, brown, horrific health conditions generally, a lot of violence coming from correctional officers. and poor food quality. We've also heard a lot of really disturbing stories about rampant drug use inside the prison. And I think that a lot of folks are surprised to hear that, because the general narrative is that people go to prison and they get clean. But we actually see that a lot of drug substance abuse issues start or are made worse on the inside. And a lot of that is because actually correctional officers are bringing substances into the prison and exploiting folks inside who are experiencing a lot of trauma and isolation. Another really unique thing about Norco and why we feel like this prison could really close is because the city of Norco's leadership has publicly expressed support for prison closure. So as we've talked about a few times today, usually prison towns are not super excited about prison closure because it provides jobs for their community. But in the case of CRC, the city of Norco recognizes that this prison has hurt their community. Before it was a prison, it was actually a resort, and that resort brought a lot of money and income and so sort of like this cultural significance to Norco, and they want to see the prison turned back into that resort that it was decades ago. And so, because of all of these reasons, our campaign is petitioning Governor Newsom to name CRC for closure in the budget. And we are partnering with local electeds to push the state toward closing CRC. And y'all can help us with that. So on the screen, you see this barcode. There's also a link here that if you can't access the barcode, you can type that into your browser. But it should take you to our petition to close CRC. If you want to read back through the reasons that we're calling for this, it is all written out there. It gives even more detail about how horrendous the conditions are inside, gives some personal testimony from folks who are incarcerated there and their loved ones. So please, please, please sign this petition. Please share it out with all of your loved ones. If folks are looking for a way to sort of get involved in prison closure and don't know where to start, this is a really great place to start.
We can also send this in a follow-up email too, just in case if, yeah, we can't sign now or if you want to share with others.
Okay. So then another one of our constant focuses is budget advocacy. I know probably some of this font is pretty small for y'all, so don't worry too much about the details, but the important thing to know is basically year round, we are advocating to ensure that carceral funding is reduced, right? That carceral budgets are reduced and that money is reallocated to community-based services that create true safety. And so we are always urging the governor to name prisons in the budget because, again, closing prisons save lots of money. Again, this year's budget is $19 billion for corrections, with $14 billion of that going to prisons specifically. And what we are working toward is that next year's budget, the 25 to 26 budget, commits to state prison closure, reduces money for corrections, and invests in communities. And on the bottom here is just like a very general timeline of what budget advocacy looks like if folks were interested in kind of, you know, the exact sort of mechanics and timeline. But you can see that in this July to December range, so where we are right now, the Department of Finance and the governor are like having a lot of discussions about essentially what will come out in the January proposed budget. So we're kind of in like a lull period right now, just waiting to see what happens in the January budget. And once that comes out, we're doing advocacy like on a daily basis, trying to get them to name prison closure in the budget, reduce the carceral budget, and invest that money in communities.
Thanks so much for all of that, Tannah. And yeah, building off of these kind of current focuses, yes, it is election season, as we all know. So one kind of addition to our work that's always being prioritized, like the budget and prison closure, like Tannah named, is unifying against Proposition 36, which is we're calling a multi-billion-dollar prison spending scam. And I'll go into the impacts of Prop 36 on the next slide, but just to kind of give an overview of what it is, Prop 36, which is on our ballots this November, is funded by Walmart, Home Depot, Target, and law enforcement that seeks to undo criminal justice reforms approved by California voters. And yeah, a little bit more about what the initiative actually entails. Prop 36 would increase penalties for several drug and theft criminalized acts, increasing state prison spending, and creating unfunded costs at the state and local levels. And we know when there's no funding stream created, or when these unfunded costs are created, oftentimes this means resources and funds will be pulled from vital areas actually proven to keep people safe. And Prop 36 will roll back Prop 47, which is an initiative passed in 2014 by us California voters with nearly 60% of the vote. And Proposition 47 has had some really incredible successes. It's helped reduce deadly overcrowding in California state prisons. It's saved nearly $1 billion. Currently to date, it's $816 million it's saved. And it's redirected those funds to K through 12 education, preventative programs, survivor services, mental health, and drug treatment programs. So there's a lot of proven benefits of Prop 47, which we know Prop 36 is seeking to reverse. And yeah, just to kind of put this into terms of how it will impact our communities, Prop 36 will create a war on drugs 2.0. You may have kind of heard it called War on Drugs 2.0, or a return back to an era of mass incarceration. And yeah, I think kind of the main threats with Prop 36, first and foremost, is that it will cut services. So yeah, Prop 36, since it seeks to repeal Prop 47, will cut, gut, and defund all those successful harm prevention programs funded under Prop 47 that are currently up and running, that Californians are currently benefiting from. And it just an interesting data point I found, it costs $131,100 annually to incarcerate just one person, and roughly $3,270 to participate in a Prop 47 funded program. So not only are Prop 47 programs actually providing people with the job, housing, mental health services, the resources they need, but it costs significantly less. Prop 36 will increase incarceration and costs. Oops, I did not mean to do that. Sorry about that. Prop 36 will drive more people into imprisonment and increase spending at every level of the criminal punishment system. So from local court costs to local jail costs to costs at the state prison level, we're going to see increases on every scale. And some projections show that Prop 36 could lead to at least 65,000 more people being locked up inside jails and prisons across California over the next 10 years, and it could add billions more in prison and jail and court costs. One projection shows that this could be $26 billion in prison spending over the next 10 years. And just to note too, I think there's been a lot of different projections about what like the exact fiscal impacts of Prop 36 will be. And I think this mystery and this kind of unknowing is part of the red flag of Prop 36. There's a history of regressive measures like this costing way more than they're anticipated to. So I would not be surprised if it did pass, we would see even more cost, even more harm than what is even feasible for us to conceptualize at this moment. And also it will threaten our communities. Prop 36 will disproportionately impact Black, Brown, immigrant, disabled and poor people, really all people currently heavily and historically criminalized by the carceral system. Prop 36 will criminalize even further. And I know we have, major houseless solutions we need to find, which we know are housing most of the time in California. And Prop 36 is projected to make this issue even worse. We know the ties between houselessness and incarceration are so strong. A lot of people incarcerated become houseless because of lack of housing and reentry services. So Prop 36 just as we're seeing it right now will just exacerbate all of these issues California is currently facing without any real solution. So we're really strongly urging a no vote on Prop 36. We know Prop 36 will significantly impact our prison closure work. It will impact our communities, and mass incarceration has never been a solution to the key investments our vulnerable communities need. So we are urging a no vote. And just quickly, I know we're kind of at time, but
when the Prop 47 took place,
there's, as I mentioned, nearly $1 billion in savings have been saved from Prop 47 funded program, or from corrections that have been redirected to Prop 47 programs. And there's a ton of success stories, and we'll share some resources you can learn more. But this is just one example. This is Gerald. He both received Prop 47 funding, which benefited him, and now is an advocate in his community that supports people returning home from prison. So this is just a quick little 1-minute snippet of the benefits from one person out of many of Prop 47.
When the Prop 47 took place, it took place right prior to me being released, approximately a year to me being released from prison in 2015, where people were starting to get a release from prison because of the overcrowdedness. People were starting to be sent to drug programs to, really address their needs instead of just serving time and returning to the community no better than they was before they left. It just raised awareness to the population that we work with, so that people really understand that there are resources out here for you if you take advantage of them. I've worked with a whole lot of clients that qualify for Prop 47, and now they allow themselves to make a commitment to the process. They allowed themselves to do the things that they needed to do to put themselves in a better position to help themselves and their families. And today they're successful as a result because of this, and they show their gratitude by volunteering with us and giving back to the community and sharing the same information about Prop 47 and how it changed their lives.
And yeah, now I will pass it to Tannah for some ways we can take action to defeat Prop 36 this fall.
Thanks, Olivia. Yeah, and this is the last slide before we take any questions. So here's another barcode. And again, y'all will get this in a follow-up email that can be shared out. So no worries if you can't access it right now. But if you do have your phones on you, you can go ahead and scan this barcode. And there are a few ways that you'll find at that website to help defeat Prop 36. The first is to tell your loved ones to vote no on Prop 36 this fall. We know it's a really consequential ballot in November. Prop 36 is not is a piece of that ballot that should not be taken lightly. So please tell your loved ones, your friends, the rest of the congregation that couldn't be at this presentation today, that voting no on Prop 36 is really important. There are also some phone banking and canvassing events. So if you're looking to volunteer, if folks that you know are looking to get involved and volunteer, these are some pretty low lift ways to sort of, learn the talking points around Prop 36, learn more about it, get involved. The third is by spreading the word on social media and in your network. So at that barcode, you'll find different social media assets also that can be reshared on Instagram, Twitter, all of the things. And then lastly, you can attend one of our Get Out the Vote events coming up soon. So there's actually a rally tomorrow in LA. I guess y'all are in San Francisco, so quite a while away from you maybe, but there are several Get Out the Vote events coming up. They're rallies, they're really beautiful community gatherings where you'll get to hear from folks who are directly impacted by the system, why Prop 36 is so dangerous to our communities, and we'll rally together and help defeat it.
Okay, Tannah and Olivia, thank you so much. So much great information there in your presentation. We do have a bunch of questions from the audience. People have jotted them down on these cards. I've got a stack of them and a few from Zoom as well. At the beginning of the presentation, you gave some great statistics. They were all about California. Did other states have a 3 strikes and you're out law type of, was that a prevalent thing around the country that led to that dramatic increase in incarceration, or is this an especially California problem and your solution is particularly for California?
That's a great question, and the answer is that it's not just California. It is the entire nation. The United States is extremely reliant on carceral systems and punishment systems. And that same, like those graphs that we saw with the big increases between the 80s and the about 2010, that was a nationwide phenomenon. Billions of dollars poured into prisons, tens of thousands, even hundreds of thousands more people locked up. So definitely not just a California problem.
Okay. You talk about the goal of abolishing prisons. Does it literally mean abolishing every prison? I mean, even for violent offenders, someone brought up the infamous case of Polly Klaas in their question. I'm sure this is a very common question that you get.
Yeah. There's so much to dive into here. Olivia, did you want to, I saw you come off mute. Did you want to take a stab at it?
Oh yeah, no, I want to hear what you're gonna say too, Tannah. But yeah, it's a big question, and I think something important to note is this is prison closure currently is all being done very incrementally. I think I mean we're seeing right now, we have always known prison closure is a moral imperative, and as abolitionists we know that too. We're also seeing that met that kind of goal met fiscally too, like with what Tannah said, the Legislative Analyst Office, which is a nonpartisan entity, saying that because I think there's actually projected to be 19,000 empty prison beds by 2029, the state can move forward with more prison closures. So I think it's important to recognize that because of all these really positive resentencing reforms that have been made, the incarcerated population is reducing, which is creating the conditions for which more incremental prison closures can happen. And I really believe that if prison closures are actually followed with that shifting of cost savings away from incarceration to community-based services, like we saw $131,000 is like the cost of incarcerating just one person. If that was all invested in our communities, I think conceptualizing larger scale prison closures would be a little easier. But I guess my main contribution right now would just be that it is being done incrementally, and it's being done in a responsible way because it's following reductions in the incarcerated population. So yeah. And Tannah, if you have anything else to add.
Yeah, no, that was great, Olivia. And I think like a top line point response that I have to that question is, yes, we want to see prisons gone because we know that they don't work, right? Like these harms are still happening at such a alarming rate, harms of all kinds, because prisons aren't rehabilitative, right? They're just based in punishment. And so the recidivism rate is very high, right? We see people who are causing harm going into prisons, not being able to access rehabilitative services, being re-traumatized inside, and then eventually getting out, and there's been no rehabilitation in place to, you know, change their actions in the future. So what I would leave as a response to that question is that prison closure doesn't mean no accountability. It just means that we're rethinking what justice looks like and working toward true rehabilitative care. Another thing that I think is really important to keep in mind when responding to that question is that I think it's very easy and it's pretty common in the public narrative to think about victims and perpetrators extremely separately, when we know that people who cause harm are often the victims of harm, right? So we think that our money, our state dollars would be much better spent on things like victim services, right? Because if folks who have experienced harm are able to access care, they're much less likely to perpetuate that harm in the future. And our current prison system really doesn't do anything to care for folks who have experienced the harm, right? It just locks up the person who has caused it, without really like providing treatment, care, trauma-informed care to folks who have experienced harm. So there's many, many layers to this, and it's a really important question. And I hope that some of those answers kind of help us rethink what the justice system could look like.
Okay, thank you. 2 questions relating to drug abuse and mental health of people in the carceral system. Do prisoners have access to mental health exams or help? And what is the procedure? I guess that means people who are already on the inside. And also, just curious where the facts came from regarding your statement that prisoners are not drug addicts going in, but become so while in prison.
I can kind of speak to the first piece around mental health. Yeah, I mean, we do a lot of inside correspondence with people currently incarcerated, and yeah, the degree that I hear from them about access to mental health services is very minimal. Tannah had mentioned CDCR has actually been sued. There was a lawsuit, a Coleman lawsuit, that basically mandated CDCR to provide a certain number of like mental health resources to people inside, and make sure mental health people working in the mental health field were being hired to support people. And CDCR and this lawsuit, I'm forgetting the year, but they have been fined multiple times in the recent years for failing to meet that. So yeah, my answer, I guess the quick answer to that question is that the mental health services provided in prisons are very, very minimal. And yeah, we often hear issues of correctional officers causing abuse and harm inside, which seems very contradictory to any like mental health care facility that prisons can sometimes be presented as. But yeah, I would say from our work and from my time at CURB, it's become very apparent that prisons, and CDCR prisons specifically, are really only perpetuating the harm. We hear, just the other day I heard someone in San Quentin State Prison was saying that they are currently not being let out of their cells to go outside and have their yard time. They're currently being kept in, and I think it was, y'all probably experienced a heat wave in the Bay last week. It was extremely hot. Ventilation wasn't good. So yeah, if that's any indication of the mental health care being provided, I think it's fair to say that it is probably very minimal. And yeah, Tannah, if you have anything else.
Yeah, echo all of that. The healthcare inside is really abysmal. And to respond to the question about drug addictions inside, I didn't mean to suggest that every drug addiction starts inside. So hopefully that's not how it came across. Sorry if it did. There are absolutely folks who are struggling with addiction before incarceration. And a really important point to make, I think, is that we think incarceration is a really inappropriate response to a health concern like addiction. But to the other piece about addiction starting inside, there are a lot of resources to learn about this. I mean, if you just Google like correctional officers smuggling drugs into prisons in California, there's dozens of news articles that will come up. And so it's been well documented, and it's pretty well known. And it's an exploitative practice, you know, to that some correctional officers use to profit off of folks inside who are looking from an escape from a really traumatizing environment. And we know this anecdotally too, like in the case of California Rehabilitation Center, where we talked about earlier, and we've been organizing on the ground there and meeting a lot of loved ones of folks who are incarcerated, and they've shared with us that, you know, one woman that I've been in contact with shared that her husband had never ever had a drug issue, was arrested for a completely separate offense, and now has a really intense drug addiction because drugs are just flowing rampantly through CRC, and there's no treatment that folks inside can access to deal with that addiction.
Have you heard that San Quentin Prison has a particularly effective drug treatment program? And have you heard about ideas to replicate it to other prisons?
Tannah, did you want to start?
Like, no, go for it.
I haven't heard that particular. I know, yeah, I don't know if this is referencing Governor Newsom's like kind of project to transform San Quentin into a rehabilitation center. But yeah, we have a lot to say about that as well. But yeah, I haven't heard anything in particular of San. I think it's actually interesting. I think there is a connection between San Quentin State Prison and California Rehabilitation Center that we're kind of currently focused on trying to shut down. Both of those prisons, I think, are kind of lauded as this like ideal prison, like as like prisons maybe with more rehabilitative service access than other prisons are. And I mean, honestly, time and time again through our correspondence inside it really does not seem like this is the case. It seems like people in both of these prisons rehabilitate in spite of the prison, not because of the prison. So yeah, I particularly haven't heard anything. But yeah, if there's more questions about that, happy to look into anything. But yeah, nothing's coming to mind that I've heard of.
Thank you. Has the women's prison in the Central Valley been closed, or is that high on your list? We heard that women were kept in cages in groups there in particularly inhumane circumstances.
Well, it depends which prison, I guess, y'all are referring to. There was a federal prison that was recently closed a few months ago. That was Federal Corrections Institution in Dublin, California. And it was closed because there was found to be a really systemic and rampant issue of sexual abuse against incarcerated women there. And so they were urgently transferred out of the prison, but the transfer process was really horrific for a lot of reasons that we can talk about. But yes, that prison was closed. We have a partner who, if y'all are interested in learning more, they're a really, really amazing organization called California Coalition for Women Prisoners. And they are essentially fighting to have both of the women's prisons in California closed. So that's an ongoing issue. And we hope to see more closed in the near future.
Okay, thank you. We have several questions on Prop 36 now. Petty theft, I could call it that, of shoplifting is widely believed to be a tidal wave of it or something like that here happening in the Bay Area. I'm not sure about Southern California, and it seems to be what's driving this Prop 36. What, ideas do you have for preventing that or addressing the community underlying causes of that? Another aspect of the question was, what does Target get from backing Prop 36? Basically, those two questions.
Yeah. Yeah, I can start. And I'll send these out too, but there's a few resources I'm dropping in the chat. One is like an in-depth understanding, like the implications of Prop 36 from the California Budget and Policy Center, which I found really helpful. But yeah, I think I would say, I get like, yeah, this is a big conversation. That's a really great question. And yeah, this is definitely not wanting to undermine fear or issues people have experienced around retail theft. I think it's really our advocacy for no on Prop 36 is really just recognizing that harsher sentences. We know Prop 36 will turn what's currently misdemeanors, which like are currently still punished by jail into felonies. So people will just be receiving longer sentences. We know that this has never contributed to public safety based off of all of the history with California's legacy of like tough on crime, draconian sentencing practices. So yeah, we recognize that there's a solution in crime data. I feel like yeah, we hear different things about it all of the time, and it's definitely not to discount experiences people have like directly dealt with. But I think a short answer is there's a problem. We don't think the solution is more incarceration and longer sentencing. We think that this will only exacerbate the issue by continuing to cut services that actually have been proven to support people. And I know we still hear issues of petty retail theft, but Prop 47 really has, I just have the number for LA right now, but in LA, Prop 46 has benefited 10,000 people. And none of the program participants of Prop 47 have recidivized. So no one has gone back to prison. So I think there's a lot of success. And I think I personally think we need to keep building off of those progressive measures and use kind of California's history. We've been here in this tough on crime mindset in the past, and that has not worked. So I think even if we have a problem, we all collectively acknowledge. I think a no vote on Prop 36 is really just acknowledging that the solution is not more incarceration. But yeah, Tannah, if you had
fair to say that the deterrence effect of felony versus misdemeanor is not proven and probably disproven by research.
Yeah, exactly. And I think longer sentences just separate people from their communities more, make it harder for people to get jobs upon returning. It further disenfranchises people instead of if people are stealing for any reason, getting them closer to a job or getting them closer to having their needs met so that they're not in a position where they need to steal for whatever reason. But I think it will only exacerbate.
Thank you. We have a couple questions relating to the role of county jails in this process of prison closure. A few years ago, there was a measure to close private prisons. What is the status of that effort? And does CURB work with opposing or closing immigrant detention centers? That's one question. Then we have, is there a known percentage of people who are transferred from one prison to another with closure or to county jails? And finally, at a recent forum, another meeting here, we learned that public pressure to quote unquote clean up homeless camps has led to overcrowded county jails. So that's like three questions.
Yeah, I can try to respond in a little bit of rapid fire. I'll try to remember all of them. So the first, private prisons. So there are no more private prisons in California. California ended the last private lease with like a private prison facility just a couple years ago. So that is a big win. And again, I think one thing that people are surprised to learn is like how horrible the state prison system is. So big win that private prisons are closed in California. we also need to be very like vigilant about criticizing state public-owned prisons. The second question about immigration detention centers, yes, we work to combat, especially ICE expansion in California. You know, we work at the state level and ICE is at the federal level. So there's a lot of overlap. One of the places that there's overlap that is sort of within the state scope that CURB works on is, like we mentioned earlier, closed prisons are often used for immigrant detention use. And we don't want to see cages just turned into other cages. So we help support the advocacy that tries to combat like closed prisons being turned into immigration detention centers. We're actually doing that right now. Sorry, I forgot the third and fourth question.
It was about homeless camp
Oh.
cleanups and how is impacting county jails, if you're aware
Oh yeah,
of that.
and the county jail population. Yeah. Yes. So we know that folks who are unhoused are much more likely to come into the into interaction with the carceral system than the general population. And those homeless encampment cleanups are like a very stark example, I think, of how that happens. And so, yes, county jails are filled with poor and unhoused people. And yeah, I think that
I just saw a question flash across from Zoom. Someone was confused about what it means to vote no on Prop 37. So let's clarify what Prop 37 is asking for and what it means to vote no on it and why that's important.
Yeah. A yes vote on Prop 37 will increase punishments for certain crimes related to retail theft and drugs. A no vote will keep the current law as is, which is that retail theft is punishable by a misdemeanor. If it's under $950, is punishable by a misdemeanor, not a felony. Yeah, I guess that's a simplistic what a yes and no vote means. I guess in adding to what a yes vote means, it would increase punishments that are not currently in place for people with certain drug uses.
Rolling back Prop 47, right? 3 strikes and you're out again.
Exactly. And it will, that's a key part. Yeah, it will repeal Prop 47. And yeah, and I see that in the chat too. And I know that it's a ton of information. So I'm just dropping a link that I think really clearly breaks down what a yes and a no vote means. If you want to read more, I know it's a lot of words being thrown out.
Okay. We are close to time. I'm going to try to get one more question. And someone asked several questions about the example of European societies. Have we studied their approach to carceral systems and, on the flip side, what they do to keep people out of the carceral systems? And are they examples for us, or is their society too different from ours to be a good example?
That's a great question and very timely, because I don't know if y'all have heard about this, but Governor Newsom has essentially coined this idea of like a California model, which is the idea that we can reform our prison system to look like Norway's. And the idea is that Norway's prisons are very rehabilitative. They have low recidivism rates, all of these things. There's several things to keep in mind here. Like the question very astutely pointed to, our society is so different from Norway's, right? We have this really tragic history in our country of the transatlantic slave trade, slave economy, and the disproportionate impact of the system on people of color. We also have so much bigger of a prison population than Norway does. The entire prison population in Norway could fit into one prison in California. So it's really stark to think about the differences in our societies. Another thing that Norway does is they have a really solid social safety net for folks. Like, folks have social safety nets to fall back on. And so these sort of crimes of need that we see so much here, whether that's petty theft or drug use, criminalization of homelessness, there's not so much of that issue in Norway. And so there's a lot of systemic factors that make Norway's prison system so different from ours. And for those reasons, we don't think that that system is like feasible and sustainable here. Another thing to keep in mind, and I'll try to keep it brief, is that Norway's prisons are still prisons, regardless of all those things that might make them like a little bit better, and the prison population is so much smaller, which is a great thing. We've seen the resurgence of far-right movements in Norway, and as that has happened, there's become an increasingly disproportionate incarceration of immigrants and people of color there. There's become an increasing use of torture practices like solitary confinement. And so it's important to keep in mind that Norwegian prisons, in any prison, is just still a prison. And we think that justice systems need to be reimagined from even something like a Norwegian prison.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Olivia and Tannah. We have about 20 people in the room. You can't see them, unfortunately, but they've been paying careful attention and asking lots of great questions. So thank you all for coming. Just by way of wrapping up, I want to mention that there'll be another presentation at Forum kind of on this topic on December 1st. Bob Bacon, a member of this church, is going to speak on abolishing the death penalty. So please come back for that. 2 weeks from today, we'll have Richard Hardigan here. He's going to speak about West Bank settler violence. He spent the summer there working with folks there and is going to talk about his experiences. And then in November, on the 10th and the 17th, we have Professor Stephen Zunes and Veterans for Peace. So a lot of good stuff coming up there. And today at 12:30 in the fireside room, we're going to have a fundraiser for a family that managed to get out of Gaza. And we're going to learn about their experiences trying to survive, basically. And that should be a good meeting. There'll be lunch there too. So if you'll want to stay for that for lunch, please do come back for that. And I also want to mention last Sunday, sadly, was the year anniversary of the tragic events of October 7th. And Bruce Newberger found a really great resource published by If Not Now. And it's basically a lamentation that speaks equally, I think, to the Israeli sad deaths and to the Palestinians. And it's really something to read. And there's a stack of them on the table out there. Please stop by and take one of those, share it with other people if it speaks to you. And that's it. Okay, so thank you. And we'll see you in 2 weeks. We don't have Forum next Sunday. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much.